Welcome back, Keir. Today you're going to be giving us a bit of an overview of your 1934 Moto Guzzi 500.
Yeah, thanks Mike. This is the 1934 Moto Guzzi 500S, actually, S for standard. It was a bike built straight after the war for the everyday Italian worker to get to and from his work. No bells and whistles. Even though it has what's called a girder front end, the rear end is rigid. So the only suspension that it really has in the rear are the springs on the seat. But this particular bike certainly has some connections to the original 500cc Normale, which was built in 1921, the first production bike built by Keir Guzzi. And that is, this engine is known as a opposed valve engine, which means that the exhaust valve is overhead and the side valve is inlet, hence the opposed valve. And that's an engine that was carried forward for quite a long time. Delorto carburetor, this particular one is just on the edge of the 34-35. Delorto carburetors were made in 1935 and this one has the upgrade. But the classical view of this old girl, the old flat engines, is the external flywheel. And simply built to keep the crankcases narrower and much more efficient, less flex for the crankshaft, and that's been a trademark of Moto Guzzi from early days. As I mentioned, the Earl's fork arrangement, kind of like a Druid spring in the middle there, but this particular tank is, in terms of early Guzzis, is a modern tank because it's known as a saddle tank that sits over the frame. Mm. The earlier Guzzis, the tank fitted between the frame members. But she's a gorgeous old bike. It's the first of the 4 speeds, and also one of the first of the heel-toe mechanism used by foot to change gears. A little bit hard to see from here, but you can see that it's got an advanced retard mechanism. And you've got a choke and all of the other bits and pieces. So when you're riding it, there's plenty of work to do to keep your mind on it, to keep it going.
Mm. So how much horsepower would there be from this engine?
Very little. It has a compression ratio of about 4.6 to 1 to enable it to run on the very poor fuels. Mm. So its horsepower is probably about 15 or 16, something like that, but don't quote me on that one. Mm.
So how do you find the handling on the road?
Well, it's not so bad. I mean, it's only a sedate old lady, and half of the fun is that it's quite agricultural. Once you get it up and running, it tracks fairly well.
Mm. And top speed?
Yeah, no speedo, but I believe it'll track along at about 70 k's an hour. A little bit of a breeze up your backside. But actually the brakes work reasonably well. They're just a narrow drum brake, but does have a brake on the rear as well. And the very early ones only had a brake on the rear, and for some time they didn't carry a brake on the front at all.
Mm. Well, that was very common practice back pre-war, certainly, just to have a rear brake.
Yeah. Mm. But no, it's a sweet old lady, and it certainly conjures up within its design, conjures up the originality of the very first Normale, which was the very first one built in 1921.
Mm. So where did you acquire the bike?
I imported it from Italy. It came by slow boat, but it's an older restoration, and it was one of the last ones to have been done by the original Italian restorers. So a lot of the pinstriping is hand painted. So yeah, I was very fortunate. By the time it turned up, I had some photos, but it certainly exceeded my expectations when it arrived, which was just fantastic.
So it was a quality restoration.
Quality restoration, yeah.
And have you had to do any mechanical work to it?
Yeah, there's been a little bit of work to do just to maintain it. There's always maintenance work to do. It actually had probably a little bit hard to see from this angle, but the mechanism that keeps the valve spring attached to the valve itself is a little collet that goes through the valve stem. And on one occasion that little collet got a little bit loose and dropped out, and so we machined another one to update it. But it's interesting enough that the exhaust valve has a hairpin spring and the inlet valve has a coil spring to close each of the valves.
That is interesting. Sort of a bit of both worlds there.
A bit of both worlds, and as I say, it's the opposed valve design is kind of unique, because the earlier English bikes, which were opposed valve, it was the inlet that was overhead and the exhaust that was side valve. This particular one is very aeronautical in its design, whereas the exhaust valve sits out in the breeze, and so the exhaust was the overhead and the inlet was the side valve. And so it was breaking a lot of ground.
So how long have you owned it?
Oh, about 10 years now.
And how many miles have you put on it?
Hard to say. It's been on display in museums for most of its life, but it's always been a go-to special events bike. So look, if I've done 200 Ks on it over that period, I'd be surprised.
Is there anything else you'd like to point out on the bike that you think is unique?
Well, interestingly enough, what's known as the centre stand.
Yeah, you just want to go over and show us that.
The centre stand down here is actually a Moto Guzzi design and invention. Up until the 1920s, each wheel had its own kind of stand that would swing down from the back of the guard and hold the wheel up. And Moto Guzzi actually designed this in 1921 on the Normale, and also designed internal oil pumps for the engine. So rather than hand pumping, which ended most of the time, hand pumped oil ended up on your pants, it has an oil tank just here. As you start it up, you've got to make sure that it is pumping back into the tank. There was a number of things that made this bike way ahead of its time. And you can see the spread eagle, and the reason the spread eagle motive is on the design is to remember that one of the three guys that was originally in the design team, his name was Giovanni Ravelli, but he passed away in 1919. So this is an emblem from the Italian Air Force across the top of their uniform, so that's how that remembers Giovanni.
Okay, well...
But not much more to add.
No, I guess not. Well, I'd like to thank you for sharing your knowledge of this bike. It's certainly a really interesting model and a piece of Moto Guzzi heritage, and in many respects Moto Guzzi were leading the motorcycling world in a number of areas at this time. So I'd like to thank you for your time.
Yeah, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
One thing that is really interesting with these old bikes, and not many people understand, that it's actually unit construction.
Yes.
And as a result of being unit construction, the gearbox and the engine is enclosed in the one crankcase. And that means that the engine is designed to spin backwards, so that the gearbox can spin forwards.
Because it's gear driven as opposed to chain driven.
Yeah, so once again, to be a unit construction back in those times, quite unusual.
Well, thank you very much, Keir, for that very interesting description of your bike.
Yeah, no worries, mate. Thank you.